Hello, good morning. And since I have the honor of kicking off the day, I thought I would start by asking what must be the most burning question on everyone's mind at a tech conference, and that is, have you ever thought about what it means to be a really good accountant? I will never forget when my father, who is a stubborn old Italian guy, maybe you've met one, you can tell by my last name, finally decided to give up on the effort of doing his own taxes, which he did not know very much about, but insisted was a waste of money to have someone else prepare, and decided to hire an accountant. Okay, great. And much to my surprise, my father absolutely loved this person and felt it was the best money he'd ever spent. And the reason why might surprise you. Of course, this accountant did a great job preparing my father's taxes. He was very accurate, he was very thorough, he knew what he was doing. But the thing that my father brought up all the time, so much so that it almost became a running joke in my family, was that his accountant used to be a lawyer. But why did he care about that? Why is that so important? Well, his accountant's legal knowledge extended beyond just basic tax law, so he was able to help him with some more complicated situations that had been going on in his life. Stay with me, I promise this is going somewhere. His accountant was also an excellent communicator with a confident presence, because that's what being a lawyer demands. And so to this day, several years later, my dad continues to gush about how amazing working with this person has been. And to me, this is a wonderful example of what it means for a career change to be valuable. Being an attorney is not a prerequisite to being an accountant. It's probably not even something that you would look for. But did our attorney turned accountant learn anything in his legal career that helped him provide better service to his clients and be better at his job? You bet he did. And his clients notice, and they appreciate it. And those aspects of career changing are exactly what we're here to talk about today. So here's a fact that I've experienced in my time in the tech industry. We are consistently encouraged to downplay the experience that we have outside of tech, whether it is educational, professional. It's just not something that we talk about a lot. Too far away. But as of March of 2021, Prudential had done a survey that showed that 1 in 5 American workers had made a career change in the past year. And that means it's highly likely that you or someone you know has had multiple careers, has been through this process. And there's one more statistic I'd like to point out. And this one's a little bit harder to measure, but it's thrown around a lot that the average person will have 5 to 7 careers in their lifetime. And the reason that this is difficult to measure is because that people define career in different ways. Maybe it's by industry or by job title, but for example, I'm either on my 3rd or 4th career, depending on how you count. I've been a professional musician, I worked in banking, and then in tech, I've also been an individual contributor and also a manager and director. I've also always had an interest in law, which means maybe I have a future as an accountant. Yet, in spite of how common this situation is, we do not do a good job of recognizing the value of the diverse educational and professional backgrounds of our colleagues. But it is absolutely true that if you have studied or worked in another industry, you have transferable skills that everybody around you should be bragging about the same way my dad was bragging about his accountant being a lawyer. So let's take a step back for a moment. Before we talk about those transferable skills, let's talk about what makes a great engineer. In preparation for this talk, I used the most scientific method I could think of to gather information: a Twitter poll. Of course, I have my own opinion about what makes a great software engineer as someone who has both worked as one and who has managed engineers, but I wanted to get perspectives other than my own, so I asked my followers, Who was the best engineer you've ever worked with, and what made them the best? And I received a really diverse group of responses in terms of job title. There were replies from folks in product, engineering, design, in leadership, and at different levels. So there were definitely some common threads, even in spite of that. I had a product director who talked about an engineer who over-communicated to keep others in the loop, who collaborated well, and who was proactive in their approach to their work. Then we had 2 responses from fellow engineers. The first one mentions kindness, communication, and deep knowledge in their area of specialization. The next mentions an engineer who doesn't expect everyone to know what they know, and the subtext there is that they do know a lot. And not only does that imply that the engineer in question has a high degree of empathy for others and an understanding of the challenges of keeping up with the changing tech industry, but also the ability to communicate that empathy and understanding to the folks they work with and make them feel comfortable. Then we had 2 responses from engineering leaders at different levels. The first mentioned something we've heard already, thoughtful, intentional communication. And then it continues to talk about the engineer's ability to teach and help others, and their pragmatism, or the ability to recognize what's practical in a given situation. And our other engineering leader echoes the sentiment about helping others improve, and also notes that the engineer they thought of was skilled at both receiving feedback and then learning new skills to make themselves better. And then finally, we had a response from a designer, and they again highlighted the ability to help and develop others, citing their use of strategies like pairing, no dumb question statements, and thorough documentation. Funny enough, not a single one of these examples described the engineer's ability to invert a binary tree. So looking at this information in total left me with what I came up with as a list of 3 really highly valued skills, the one that people talk about the most: communication, growth mindset, and leadership. Communication was the attribute mentioned most often and the one that was usually cited first, so let's dig into that a little bit. This makes sense to me. Effective engineers need to communicate in a lot of directions, right? They're communicating with folks in different functions, product design, engineers on their team, engineers on other teams, engineers at conferences like we're all doing right here. And the nuances of communication were mentioned a lot too. So we placed heavy emphasis on kindness, empathy, proactivity, and of course collaboration, because in most cases you won't be working alone. There were also a lot of allusions to the ability to improve and in different ways, and these can all be attributed to a growth mindset. And if you've never heard that term before, you might be wondering what it means, so let's talk about some specific callouts, and then we'll get a little bit into the definition. The folks who had growth mindset valued learning, accepted feedback, and they care about helping others. And growth mindset is defined by Carol Dweck in her book Mindset, and she calls it the belief that one can improve by dedicating time, effort, and energy. And she elaborates further. She goes on to mention that those with growth mindset embrace challenges, persist through obstacles, learn from criticism, and are inspired by the success of others. That sounds like our example engineers too, and it's a good framing for a broad set of competencies that are really valuable in engineers. And finally, the examples we had indicate that leadership is a highly valued skill. And that doesn't mean that we're talking about tech leads or even anyone in a formal leadership role at all. Rather, they lead on their teams by making others feel included and making sure they don't feel like they're asking dumb questions, by hearing input and making changes. They lead by being pragmatic. They have an awareness that concepts and theories they've learned need to be applied in a practical way. A great engineer isn't somebody who just runs off and does a refactor because they found a new great framework they love, but it won't provide any value. And of course, they lead by teaching others and helping them grow. So now that we have a decent breakdown of some highly valued skills, you might be thinking like, okay, but how does this apply to me and what does it have to do with changing careers? So to start, I'd like to share some examples of how I have thought about translating my experience as I navigated my own personal transition from being a professional musician to being an engineer and then eventually an engineering manager. So I'll tell you a couple of stories, and then from there we're going to go on to talk about some practical strategies for how this can help you and your teams. So, as I've alluded to a few times now, in a past life, I was a classical musician. I studied the clarinet at a state university in New York, and I was really passionate about being on stage, which I guess is something that has continued. And I really was very clear that I didn't want to be a teacher, I didn't want to be a music therapist, I wanted to perform. But the thing about music performance is that it's extremely competitive. If you're going to do this, it's something that you have to really dedicate a lot of time and effort to learning and getting better and being at the top tier of what you're doing. And so I chose to do that work, to dedicate that time. And I learned a ton of different strategies along the way for improving in different areas. So for example, one of my instructors taught me that playing a difficult technical passage backwards was a great way to build the neural pathways and help build muscle memory. I also employed the strategy that maybe you have done with various things, which is to repeat something until I got it right 3 or 5 or 10 times, just to make sure that it was really committed to memory. And then I would also use my knowledge of music theory to break down complicated pieces of music so that I could understand them better in simple terms with things like scales and arpeggios. So fast forward some years, and I made the decision to attend a software engineering boot camp. I was working full-time as a bank manager to pay my bills, and I decided to learn to code from scratch. I had no previous experience, I was just studying stuff online. And I learned enough to pass the admissions interview to this boot camp, and I was starting to chip away at, they gave us 3 weeks of pre-work that we needed to do before we could start the program, and this stuff had to be done. And it was hard. It was really hard, or it was hard for me at the time. And it was so hard, in fact, that even after paying a few $1,000s as a deposit and quitting my job in banking, I thought, maybe I'm just not going to do this, and I'll do something else. And at some point along the way, in doing that work that I found really hard, I realized that I had learned some things when I was studying music that I could translate to this situation. Some of those same techniques I talked about before were really helping me, and they were confidence building and made me feel less overwhelmed. They allowed me to adopt a growth mindset, because I knew that if I made the proper effort and took the right approach, I could learn what I needed to know. And the translations of the strategies that I used are not necessarily literal or one-to-one, but they are pretty clear. I was able to chip away at problems by breaking them down into smaller pieces, much the same way I used music theory to break apart a piece of music and make it less overwhelming. I used repetition to make myself faster working through logical problems. I wasn't building muscle memory, but I was building the ability to look at a problem and solve it quickly and identify patterns in algorithms, for example. And while it might sound ridiculous to say that I had something to learn from playing difficult music backwards, there is a little bit of something there too, because we have all experienced that stepping through a problem with a sample input, and perhaps even doing it in reverse, is pretty common and can help you work through a problem. And of course, this also rang true when I finished my program and I was starting to prepare for interviews. At that time, whiteboarding was a really common way of interviewing instead of PR reviews or take-home assignments, and I used the same strategies to become more confident at my whiteboarding skills. I want to talk a little bit more about growth mindset in this context as well. Growth mindset also requires the foundational belief that you can succeed. And that also means accepting failure. But rejection is really common in the music world, and that's something that I experienced a lot. There's a long piece in the New York Times where the author tracks down instrumentalists from the Juilliard Conservatory class of, I think it was 1994. And Juilliard is probably the premier music conservatory, at least in the US, and probably one of the top ones in the world. 25% of those graduates have full-time jobs in music. That means 1 in 4 of the graduates of one of the most prestigious programs in the world are actually working full-time in the field that they have studied for so long. And that's not because those folks aren't good musicians, but they do face a lot of rejection. And it can be for a lot of reasons. For example, the sound one musician has may not be a fit for the group that they're auditioning for, and therefore it won't blend in and it won't sound right. Or their interpretation of a piece may not be the same as the auditioner or the conductor, and so they don't see eye to eye on what they're trying to express. In order to cope with this rejection that I was feeling when I was going through these auditions and keep some semblance of mental health, I had to internalize that I could learn, I could improve, and that every rejection was not a reflection on my self-worth. And it wasn't easy, but I was able to move through that a bit. Having these experiences also helped me with the absolute onslaught of rejections that I faced when I started in the tech industry. Just like in music, teams who are hiring engineers are looking for lots of different things beyond just that basic technical skill, right? They could be looking for people with very specific skill sets. They could be looking for new hires who are super passionate about that product they're building, whatever it is. So there could be a whole lot of ways in tech, too, that the alignment just isn't there. This one really took me a long time to absorb. Even with all the rejection that I experienced as a musician, rejections were hard, particularly earlier in my career. A few years ago, I interviewed for a job as an engineering manager of a front-end team at a large company. And I was really excited because I was like, okay, this is the perfect fit for me. I am a front-end specialist. I love people managing. This company has a cool product that I'm interested in. So everything sounded great. As the interview process wore on, I realized there was a lack of alignment. They not only wanted a front-end expert and someone to lead their team, but they were also looking for basically an architect. And it wasn't me anymore. I had spent a lot of years studying and learning how to be a better manager. It was also clear that people leadership skill just wasn't that important to them. And putting all that aside, I pushed myself through the process, and I felt like I did really well in the interviews. And they rejected me. At first, I was really distraught. I felt like for all the work that I had done throughout my career, I was still a failure. And then I thought about all the auditions I took where I didn't get the gig. I knew I was a good musician. And while the rejections were tough, I didn't take them to heart in the same way. I knew there could be other reasons that was happening other than I wasn't good at what I was doing. So I applied that as I talked myself through this situation. The job wasn't right for me, and I wasn't right for the job, and it would have been a disservice to both parties for me to take that role. I'll walk you through one more little story, and then we're going to talk about practical application. So we've covered growth mindset a little bit. I want to talk about leadership. One of the key leadership competencies that we talked about earlier in our examples was teaching or mentorship. And I will not stand here and tell you that every music teacher I ever had showed me great methods for teaching. The music world is not very well known for being kind and understanding. But after I graduated, I started teaching private lessons to young students, so focusing on kids who were just getting started. And the most important thing for a musician at that stage is to build a really solid foundation of good habits, because as we all know, with whatever bad habits we have, they are extremely hard to break. I had one student who was doing really well generally, but he was struggling with the way he held his instrument. He was really tense, and I knew that eventually that would keep him from being able to perform things that were difficult or fast. He needed a good foundational hand position, but also he was 8 years old. And it's very hard to explain to an 8-year-old why they're going to care about something in 10 years. So I resisted the temptation to correct every little mistake he ever made, and instead I was very strategic about what I was trying to do. I picked the most important moments, and I explained what I wanted to see happen. And sometimes I didn't even say something was wrong. I just said, here, try this, and let's see how it works. And of course, I gave him a lot of praise about other things that were going well for him, and he really did progress nicely and ended up playing clarinet for a long time. I learned a lot from that experience, and I think a quote that one of my music teachers repeated a lot really captures it. And funny enough, it's by Pope John the 23rd. It's, see everything, overlook a great deal, correct a little. You might notice everything, but you need to be strategic about what feedback you give and when, or you risk completely demoralizing someone or confusing them. I could probably give 1,000 examples of teaching relationships in my engineering career, but I have one that's my favorite. This is still drawn from personal experience, and it relates to my professor's favorite quote here, but it's how someone else taught me. Teaching is a huge part of everything we do as engineers, right? Even if it's not formal or obvious. Code reviews are a great example. In one of my roles as an individual contributor, very early in my career, I finally saw the connection to my days as a musician. We had a new hire on the team, and he was someone who was much more experienced than me, and we didn't have a developed relationship. We didn't have a lot of trust between us. I was much earlier in my career, and it made me really nervous about having him review my work. Looking back, I'm sure he had 1,000 things he wanted to tell me, but he was very strategic about what he decided to do. Sometimes he would add suggestions or nits, but it was always very clear to me exactly which things he wanted me to fix and why there was value in making those changes. So it was clear that he wasn't just trying to tell me that I was wrong or that I was bad at my job. And he also always left a few compliments, genuine ones, so that I could understand that he really was trying to help me. He was one of my favorite coworkers that I've ever had, and he taught me a lot, much more than other people I'd worked with who probably had equal knowledge or maybe more, because he knew how to communicate his points well and how to support his coworkers. He taught me pretty much the same I taught that 8-year-old student, and I'm very grateful for it. I'm going to skip ahead through one more example so that we have time to throw this fun thing around a little bit at the end. So let's talk about some strategies for how you can use all this information about what makes a great engineer and career changing in your everyday. I will note that the stories I just told were not things that I necessarily realized made sense in the moment. It took a lot of intentional thinking over a long period of time, and some things were just kind of came to me naturally. That's because it's hard work in general to frame your past experience this way when other people aren't doing it, right? We're not talking about this. It was also made worse because of something I was told when I was still studying in my software engineering boot camp, which was to come up with a justification for why I was changing careers and then bring it up in all of my interviews. Tech and music are both creative and intellectual, and I love both of those things, and so that's why I'm leaving that behind and I'm going to do this now. With apologies to my bootcamp, it was terrible advice, because I felt like I was constantly apologizing for even being there in my interviews. I felt like I needed to explain away my background rather than embrace it, and it made me unsure of myself. Did I really belong in the tech industry? Did I have anything to bring to the table on a team? And I did, and I didn't know it until much later. Ultimately, the harm didn't keep me from having a career in tech, but it sent me on a long and winding journey to find my way back to where we are right now. So if at any point you've kind of been thinking, yeah, I don't know how to bring my experience from a past, something I've studied or somewhere I've worked into my role, or you identify with feeling kind of self-conscious, let's talk about some practical strategies that you can use to help you impress others with your background rather than feel the need to apologize for it. We'll talk about your team and your company in a bit, but let's start with some things you can do on your own. The first one is something it took me too long to get started on, and it's simple, but it's hard to do. You have to fight off the urge to never talk about what came before your career in tech, or to deem everything about it totally irrelevant. This will take some time to adjust to if that's the habit that you've been in for a long time. And obviously you shouldn't force it. Don't try to make connections that aren't there. And don't try to sell what you bring up or think about or make justifications even to yourself, because I know for sure that accountant never did that with his legal background. I have never met a lawyer who was ashamed or self-conscious about having been a lawyer. The next good step is one that I didn't do, at least intentionally, for a long time, and that is to reflect on strengths you've developed in whatever else you've done, or in subjects you've studied. Consider, as I have, drawing parallels between situations like I did in the stories before that you encountered in the past and ones that you're tackling now. This likely won't come to you all at once, but as you start to draw connections, it will become a lot more obvious in your day-to-day what your strengths are and how you're using them. And if you're stuck and you're not sure, right, like, well, I used to do X and now I'm doing Y and I have no idea what the connection is, you can refer back to the 3 things that we talked about earlier. Communication, leadership, growth mindset are things that are very likely you've learned elsewhere. And so you can start to pick away at that and see what you come up with. It won't all become clear overnight, but taking time to stop and think is a great start, and you can keep some notes as you go along. When you've had time to collect your thoughts and form a little bit of your perspective, I think this is where things start to really jump into action. You can use those reflections as a starting point to talk to your manager, your mentor, your sponsor, someone that you work with whose opinion you value, who's helping you advance your career. And you could have a range of potential goals here. It might not be to get a promotion, or it might be. It might be to find a project where you can really show off what you are good at, or you can really feel more excited about that work because it's something that you're passionate about, because it connects to your previous life. If you have a clear job description or career ladder where you work, that's a great place to start looking at the skills that you want to highlight, because you'll see very clearly what your company values. If you don't, or if your career ladder doesn't include anything but technical skill, we can talk about that a little bit more in the strategies for teams. So your goal here is to create alignment, to find out what the leaders you work with value and how you can map that to your skills. Any well-intentioned leader will appreciate this kind of conversation and will look for ways to get you the opportunities that you want or need. And then I saved a very difficult task for last. Once you truly know how your experience is helping you be better at your job, you'll want to self-promote. And for all the reasons we've discussed, this can be really hard. But lean into it as much as you can. When it's appropriate, talk about things that you've done in your previous career that apply to your role now. And do it at work. Do it in interviews. Don't be afraid to show people what you know. After all, it's impressive to have accomplishments outside of what you're doing right now. My first reaction to an accountant who became a lawyer wouldn't be to question their abilities as an accountant. I would just be impressed that they were able to get through all of those years of school. And then now I would like to talk a little bit about what we can do as teams to help support folks who have made career changes. I realize that everybody in this room is probably in a different type of role. You might be an individual contributor or a manager or in any other situation in your company. So the path to making an impact here might look different for each of you. You might only be able to make suggestions, or you might be able to lead projects. Either way, you definitely can make a difference here. Even in a management role, I've found that flipping the script on some of this stuff at my current company is not a quick fix. In my current organization, it's taken me close to 4 years to start making some improvements to our interview process, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it has helped significantly, and I think it's really making an impact. So in your hiring process, you're going to want to make sure that you're asking candidates questions about their non-technical skills, and ones that your organization values, like communication or growth mindset, or whatever else is helpful where you work. You would know that better than I do. You can also create technical exercises that give signal about those soft skills while still being technical. If you ask someone to review a PR, not only can you get a sense for how well they understand the code, you can also get a sense for how they communicate that to you and how they would give feedback to others. A pairing exercise can show you how well someone collaborates. Can they take feedback? Can they give you feedback in a way that is kind and empathetic? If you can't change these things yourself, again, find a way to raise this with the appropriate party at your company. It might be a manager, someone in HR, and kick off a conversation about changes you'd like to see. You never know where that might go, and sometimes it really does take time. If it's helpful in those efforts specifically about hiring, I do have a longer talk about tech hiring that includes more detail about what I believe is a more inclusive, career change friendly, and practical approach to hiring. So feel free to check that out if you'd like, or I'd be happy to talk about it at any point while we're all here. Some of the most difficult work we also have to do as an industry to recognize the value of career changing is to align on what we actually want out of our engineers in this non-technical sense. Twitter threads are nice, right? The people I talk to probably have decent opinions, but before you work on something, you want to know that it's going to be valued at your company, right? I really like career ladders or competency matrices for these reasons. Of course, they come with challenges and overhead. They take time to build. They have to be maintained. They make end-of-year reviews take longer. But they force organizations to think about what they want out of their engineers. At my current job, we actually have 4 types of skills that we measure on our career ladder, and they are technical effectiveness, communication, and leadership. It's a helpful framework, and it places explicit value on those non-technical skills and their place in the technical workplace that we have. And if you're not in a place to influence changes in a career ladder yourself, that would be a great thing to raise to your manager as well. And there are lots of great examples online for organizations that might be looking to put this into place. One good one is I used to work for Circle CI. They have a great career ladder available publicly. And if you don't already have career ladders, and developing one will take too long for the immediate impact you're looking to have, you can also do this with better job descriptions. You want to have an external job description that is reflective of the skills that your company actually wants and the real work that you do every day. As part of creating good job descriptions, it's valuable to think about the actual requirements of doing the job beyond just the technologies you use. So you don't end up with job postings that look like this, which starts out strong with a computer science degree as the first desired skill. I won't ask how many people have computer science degrees, but I'm sure it's not everyone. With outstanding interpersonal and communication skills landing almost, but not completely at the end. Even though we've seen that those things are not the last thing that people think about when they talk about a great engineer. We also have this one, which is kind enough to mention equivalent practical experience in lieu of your computer science degree, but it doesn't talk about anything other than technical skills at all. So unless you'd be this company's first engineer, and spoiler alert, I pulled this from a huge company's website, you'll probably need to be effective at working with other people. And as I mentioned before, a good job description can have a practical application even after someone is hired, because when they're well done, they can be a good alternative to that career ladder as a starting point for conversations about what the expectations of the job are and any growth areas that you might have during something like a year-end review. The last thing is, the best thing we can do as teams is to advocate for each other. There have been a lot of points in my career where encouragement from others has made all the difference in my confidence and my ability to keep going. This might seem small, but keep in mind that you should give positive feedback to others, specifically for their non-technical contributions. Of course, you should be genuine, but tell them when you see a job well done. Praise their communication, show appreciation for their leadership. And moreover, when you hear about non-technical backgrounds of folks on your team or at your company, ask them questions, be curious. Show appreciation for what they know. This will go a long way toward normalizing this kind of thinking and discussion. It's great for confidence to come from within, but it can help to have the support of those around you. I hope some of this has resonated with you. I do have notes available for this session, which also links to the slides, so you can scan this QR code. And before we wrap up, I'll tell you one more little story. As part of my tech career, I've really fallen in love with doing these kinds of presentations, and I've spent a lot of time trying to improve. A couple years ago, I recorded a virtual session during the pandemic for an online conference, and one of the benefits that that conference offered to me was a session with a public speaking coach. And when I went in, I didn't really know what to expect from that. But I did go in with an open mind. And one of the first things that my coach told me was that prior to starting her business coaching public speakers, she had been an actress. She had a degree in theater. And I never really thought about it, but speaking on stage is not just being here, giving a presentation, but it is a performance of its own. It's a lot more like acting than I ever realized. And conferences aren't just about content. You want to be able to capture someone's attention, to communicate clearly what you're trying to say. And I never would have looked at public speaking from that angle had I not met her. And it gave me a new perspective that's been tremendously valuable. Her career change made her a better coach, and in turn made me a better speaker. And that is the value that a career change can have. Thank you.